Welcome everybody to my talk, Auditing Algorithms, How Online Platforms Shape Our Digital Environment. For the agenda today, we will start with exactly that question. And to answer it, I will present a series of examples that will illustrate problems with online platforms that are ultimately powered by algorithms. Then I will explain why these problems occur. And then I will explain why I will dig more into the conceptual part of auditing and considerations. And then I do summarize some takeaways and final remarks. How do online platforms shape our digital environment? The first example that I brought today is about Google search results. Around 2010, a researcher Googled Black girls when looking for possible topics to talk about with her young daughter. She found the following. Half of the results were links to pornography, as well as all ads. 2 of them were of a rock band whose members were white men. 3 results were actually relevant, though pushed to the bottom of the first page. Another example comes from the image search results. Here, researchers have found gender stereotypes exaggeration for professions. For example, for the query doctor, you would only obtain pictures of men, mostly white. Additionally, the researchers recruited participants to measure the effect of these search results on their perceptions. They took people to the lab and confronted them with the image search results that they were getting from Google and found that the exaggerated stereotypes presented in the image search results shifted the estimations toward their error. In other words, the search results made their perceptions worse by also exaggerating the stereotype. This example not only illustrates how platforms shapes the digital environment, but also how it affects the way in which humans perceive reality. The underrepresentation of women in image search results has been also tested in more general scenarios. Otebaga and colleagues tested the query person in Microsoft Bing instead of Google. In this case, one would have expected that half of the pictures would be of men and half of women. Instead, only 1/3 of the pictures contain women on them. This result actually corresponds with results obtained in the 80s, in that case for pictures in magazines. And colleagues and I recently tested this again in Microsoft Bing and found the same result for the queries person and intelligent person. We also tested this in Google. However, we found the expected results, so a 50-50 distribution for the query person, which is good news, which quickly faded once we tested intelligent person, finding the same result as the previous literature again. Now, we were not expecting those results when we tested this because we thought that it was probably fixed, but clearly that was not the case. In reality, we were interested in something that is called faceism. That is a bias in which women are represented with a lower face to body ratio. Basically, more body is shown in pictures of women and more face in pictures of men. The paper of the 80s that I mentioned in the previous slide uncovered this bias as well. We also found the same bias for most of the cases in images obtained in 4 search engines. A well-known project is called Gender Shades. The researchers here show that face recognition platforms performs poorly for women with darker skin. They tested this in 3 different platforms, and consistently the results were poorer for women with darker skin. Another example that is connected to what I've been talking about is when Black people try to use the Zoom virtual background. A PhD student realized of this when he was talking to his colleague, and they were testing the background. And when they did so, the face of the Black person was removed. The PhD student then went to Twitter to expose the zoom problem. And when he posted the picture, his friend was completely cropped out from that tweet. And this is due to the Twitter automatic cropping algorithm that effectively was focusing on the person with white skin. Now, one can think that that was an isolated case, but people went online and started testing and doing different experiments with this, and more or less consistently, they were finding the same effect. For example, here for politicians, no matter if the Black one was on the top or the bottom, it always selected the politician with the white face. Researcher has also found gender and race issues on online labor market search websites, such as the freelancing platforms TaskRabbit and Fiverr, as well as the hiring ones, Indeed, Monster, and Career Builder. Now, I focus at the beginning on gender and race, in part because it is easier, they are easier to understand and pretty much on the nose. For example, I don't have to explain why they are wrong, but the following examples are perhaps a bit more subtle, though depending on your background, they might be as obvious as well. So I will start with more elaborate examples here. One of them being automatic labeling. One of the researchers of these groups of Cabañas and colleagues noticed that they got an advertising of Mr. B&B. Mr. B&B is an LGBT-friendly platform to find accommodation, very similar to Airbnb. The researcher got curious, and to understand why he got the ad, he went into the interest of the ad preferences. These interests can be automatically selected by Facebook according to likes and clicks. And he found himself tagged with the label homosexuality. Considering that sexual preference is sensitive personal information, the researchers decided to systematically find which other labels could be found. In total, they found 2,092 sensitive attributes related to political alignment, religion, immigration, sexual orientation. These are top 20 examples that were reviewed by experts, and in which 12 panelists agreed of being sensitive. These interests, the problem here is that they were automatically selected. Only 0.03% of them, of the 100,000 labels that were used in 4,500 users, were actually added by themselves. So most of them were added automatically. These interests are used to sell ads, which is problematic in itself. But there are also bigger risks. For example, they could be used to initiate hate campaigns. Just imagine perhaps in countries in which homosexuality is illegal. Or one can try to identify the people behind these labels as well. Additionally, another research found that only 27% of the labels were accurate. Labeling can also be intransparent. In one study, researchers programmed a set of bots, let's call them personas, that simulates humans navigating through the internet. The researchers split the personas in two groups. The first group visited substance abuse websites, and the second group did not visit any website, and they control for everything else. They checked if any of the groups received advertising for substance abuse, And as expected, the first group did, and the second didn't. Now, they also checked for difference in Google Ads preferences, but they did not find anything. So regardless of whether receiving substance abuse ads is adequate or not, and focusing here on the second part, a group of personas was treated different from another one without there being a justification of why this happened. A phenomenon that has been studied as well is the filter bubble effect. Although the evidence here is mixed, there are cases in which it has been demonstrated. For example, in YouTube, the researchers again used personas similar to the previous experiment to show that those personas who had visited previous videos of conspiracy theory were also more likely to be feedbacked with search results that also contain conspiracy theories. And this was also true for the recommendations that appear on the right side bar of YouTube. Now, the later examples are more related to what is called personalization. The following studies also involve the use of personas, and it's very common in algorithm auditing, though sometimes they also compare against humans as well. And they use the robots or personas as a baseline. So for example, it has been, personalization has been studied for pricing. In this case, for factors such as the browsing history, creating personas that visited websites that are associated with either wealthy or thrifty consumption. The ones that visited wealthy associated websites are offered more expensive or were offered more expensive products. And another thing that is very common in personalization is geolocation. Depending on where you send the query, you get different results. Researchers have also measured that personalization accounts for 12% of differences in results, the main factor being logged in Google and also the geolocation. Now, one of the reasons that perhaps explain why personalization does not show even stronger effects is source concentration. For example, the fact that Wikipedia often appears among the first results in Google leaves least space for personalization. Somehow, one of the results is already will be already taken by Wikipedia. This has been studied for the top stories that, depending on the type of search, appears among the results of Google and display major recent news headers. And here, researchers have looked at the sources of the news, finding that 20% of sources concentrate 86% of all results. Looking directly at the news search result, not just at the top stories, researchers have found similar effect that national outlets, as opposed to local or regional media organizations or newspapers, dominate the search results. We did our part here and explored video search results and found a similar concentration. In this case, most of the results came from YouTube. In Google, this dominance of YouTube is followed again by big media companies. So why all of these problems occur? A lot of it has been attributed to machine learning algorithms being opaque and provided no explanation of their outputs. What happened is that you have a very generic set of instructions to learn things. This is what is called the algorithm. or the machine learning algorithm to be more precise. And then the researchers throw some, or the data scientists throw some data to train the algorithm. And when you ask the machine, there is no explanation for why it gave such results. This has ultimately been attributed to the data itself. For example, in the case of image search results for person, where I showed a representational bias of gender, it could simply be because there are less pictures of women overall on the internet. Those are good explanations, but there is another simpler one, that the details and data are owned by companies, and those companies simply doesn't want us to know about it, because there is a conflict of interest at play. Now, the response from different companies has also been different. Twitter, to its credit, in the case of Twitter automatic cropping, they quickly apologized and promised to check the issue, which they did, and resulted in a change of the mechanism, one that is also supervised by humans. And they also open a competition to further investigate the problem. Facebook, on the other hand, is hindering research projects. There is the case of Algorithmic Watch. They have recruited participants who install software in their computer that collects data from Instagram. With a similar approach, the NYU Ad Observatory collects advertisements in Facebook, and Citizen Browser from the markup also collects data from Facebook. In July, the researchers of Algorithmic Watch stopped the Instagram project and deleted the data after being addressed and pressured by Facebook. In August, Facebook closed the accounts of the NYU researchers, effectively stalling the project. And 2 weeks ago, Facebook changed the platform, hindering the data collection of the markup. In this case, Facebook manipulated the labels that are used by technologies that read the content for blind people. And yes, it affected the accessibility for this group. And if you have checked the news this week, you have realized about the whistleblower, Franz Haugen. She supports the impression that we have been getting that Facebook is not progressing much in the topics against hate speech, violence, and misinformation, which would explain why the company is so resistant to academic scrutiny. I think I have justified the need for supervising or auditing the performance of online platforms that are ultimately supported by algorithms. So now I will talk about a bit more directly about it. Algorithmic auditing is the process of investigating the functionality, if the algorithm does the right thing, and impact. What is the impact for society of that algorithm, of the outputs of decision-making algorithms? And there are several ways of achieving this. Bandy recently published a literature review of papers on the topic and classified them according to the methodology that were used. In some cases, research looked directly at the source code of the algorithm, tried to find problems directly on the code. Other studies used direct scraping using platform APIs. And as a side note, I talked about collecting online data through APIs last week, if you want to check that out. Another way is through the personas that I explained before, also called SOC and carrier puppets. And through crowdsourcing, as the collection projects that were hindered by Facebook. All of them were recruiting participants for the project. Now, what has been investigated? And I'll be using examples we already saw for this. Discrimination, such as the case of gender shades in which the algorithm performs poorly against one specific group of people. Distortion, in which the image set results for the query doctor is a good example, because the results distort real life statistics, though in my opinion, results in this case should be balanced across gender and race. Exploitation, for example, inferring sensitive data from their users and then use that information to put an ad without consent. And misjudgment. One example here is the political advertising that Facebook fails in label it as such. In this case, it would be misjudging them of being non-political. For example, research found many instances for the Brazilian electoral process a few years ago. And in reality, this has also been a focus of research of the NYU Ad Observatory project, in which they basically suggest that this, for example, is a political advertising against climate change initiatives. We also saw different types of platforms in which this has been investigated. We saw the case of search, advertising, recommendation systems, pricing, and computer vision. But also there are studies in criminal justice, language processing, and mapping, Google Maps, for example. And here are some of the numbers for each of these categories, also from the literature review of Bandy. We see that there is an unbalanced distribution on some of the categories and probably a space for future research as well. The good news are that there is an increase on this type of study in the later years. At the same time, studies have concentrated primarily on Google. Colleagues and I have been addressing this gap by exploring results in other search engines, such as Bing, Baidu, Yandex, DuckDuckGo, and Yahoo. We also believe that using other search engines will help understanding which of these problems come from specific platforms and which are more general. Also having platforms of other countries, such as Yandex, which is Russian, and Baidu, which is a Chinese search engine, is also valuable as they focus on different markets and reflect different realities. Finally, one must be careful when it comes to study these platforms. So one needs to control for a variety of factors in the experimental design phase. And here I will analyze the case of the search engines, which I'm more familiar with. So the first thing that you have to consider is time, because results change quickly. So if you are comparing two things, you probably want to compare them at the same time. And perhaps you want to also compare them twice at different points in time, let's say 1 week apart. The browsing history, as we already saw, it has an effect. Depending on what the machines have browsed before, then they create digital traces that could potentially affect their results. Geolocation is fairly clear. Depending on the region, this will change. So you should consider at least 2 regions when you are auditing things. Ranking is particularly important when you are looking at the order of things, because it has been demonstrated that most of the people look only at the top 3 or 5 results and almost never go to the second or third page. However, it has to be taken into account that even though people do not go to like third or fourth page, it also reveals information, the third, fourth page, and etc. reveals information of how these results are organized and ranked. So they are still important to observe when you are auditing algorithms. The browser type could have an effect. We found small but significant effects in a recent study. The language definitely has a very strong effect, depending on which language. If you are using English or Spanish, you are going to get probably completely different results. And another one is randomization. So even if you put two of these robots, two of these personas in the same conditions, in the same region, with the same browsing history or with no browsing history at all, the same time of the query, the location, and you control for everything, you still get different results in two machines. So there is some uncontrolled noise that you have to account for. Usually you can address this by putting the same way you use with humans, you put different machines on the same condition. And finally, a more methodological aspect is the cookie concept and CAPTCHA pop-up. The cookie concept pop-up is the one that started appearing after the GDPR entered into effect a few years back. And then here you have to decide if you actually want to accept the cookies for your personas, for example, or if you want to study it without cookies. And CAPTCHAs are problematic because, for example, Yandex doesn't let you do more than something like 50 queries a day. So it's also something that you have to consider in your methodological design. Some general considerations are that if you have participant data, you need ethics approval and informed consent of the participant. There was also a talk about ethics concerns in data collection that you can visit as well in this series. Auditing might break the terms and conditions of platforms. Personas can be configured to use false accounts, and that might break the terms of the company. And all of this could be automated data collections, which companies are not happy with. Now, the terms and conditions also varies according to platforms. Search engines are generally open to it. Social media platforms are not so keen to this kind of studies, in part because they argue that they have data of participants, but if you have informed consent of the participant, the data in reality belongs to the participant and it should not belong to the company. Keep in mind data rights, especially in the case of images. Not everything that is posted is legal, and you might end with some illegal content on your collection. To conclude, here are some takeaways and final remarks. Algorithmic auditing is a set of methods to expose problems in platform technologies. I also see it as an opportunity to steer the future by avoiding the perpetuation of existing inequalities. The image search result case for the query doctor is, again, a good example. Yes, it exaggerated the stereotypes. So that should be fixed. But researchers could pressure so that platforms steer the wheel towards equality instead of perpetuating the current problem. There is a conflict of interest between companies and research. And in that regard, there are ethical considerations, but in cases there is not that many alternatives of how to get this data. And good news are that some regulations are being put into place. The GDPR was already approved, and there is these other regulations that are currently being analyzed in the US and Europe, mostly related with accountability and transparency. And there is, at least on INC, some sections on auditing. It is not clear yet how this will look like, but there is at least a movement that is initiating in this direction. Thank you very much.